Rampant stagflation crushes ordinary Australians. Martin North, John Adams in the Industry Tribune. John, hello.
Hi Martin, how are you going today?
Yeah, pretty good. An emergency post, huh?
Yes, we were thinking of doing a show in the next few days, but all of a sudden at 11:30 this morning, the Australian Bureau of Statistics released their quarterly CPI number, and it was a shocker according to its historical standards. So the highest in 20 years at 5.1% year on year, and the quarter was at 2.3%. So it is the lead story all around the country. Now you and I have been talking about the risk of inflation, stagflation for the last few years. So this sort of story shouldn't be a bit of a shock to us. But obviously that now it's front and center. It has quite a number of significant implications, both politically but also economically, particularly in the context of your mortgage stress data.
Yes, absolutely. And there was no surprise. It was always going to be a high one. But I should also just make the point that the real official statistics and the real statistics aren't the same anyway, right? Because there are all sorts of reasons we've discussed before why the actual real number is always understating the true situation. And of course, the non-discretionary element, which is the things you still got to pay for, is at 6.6%, right? So that's a more real number, I think.
Yes. So when the official number is 5.1 and non-discretionary 6.6, you know that real inflation, the unmanipulated version of inflation, is probably north of 10%. And that's one of the key factors in terms of when we look at your mortgage stress data. So the ABS and the government says we have record low unemployment at 4%, potentially going into 3.9% soon, and yet we have mortgage stress at 42%. I think I looked at one of your latest posts, and that is still 10 percentage points above the pre-pandemic level. And you've got to think to yourself, well, why is stress still at 10 points higher? One of the key factors is because the real rate of inflation that has been eating into people's disposable income, and there is a lot of cost of living pressure well before in terms of today's announcement. Now, in terms of today's announcement, I would say a couple of points. I think a lot of it is driven by what the RBA and the government did during 2020, 2021 with the response to the pandemic. But I would also say that there are some supply chain issues. I think that's fair to say, but I think there's also this temporary factor of the Russia-Ukraine situation, and that has obviously had an impact about fuel prices. Now, the war started at the end of the quarter. So remember that today's numbers is a quarterly number. So it's an average of January, February, March. The war started at the end. So I think we can say that fuel was reasonably elevated even before the war started. But then obviously, perhaps in the March element of the CPI for the last quarter, fuel went quite high because fuel prices started to go high even before the war started, because there was the anticipation of war, and the financial markets were already moving in that direction because of increased geopolitical tension. So I think we can say that if the situation in the Ukraine was to normalize to some degree, a ceasefire, a peace deal, and trade relations were to normalize and some of the sanctions were relaxed, we could easily see oil prices come back down quite substantially if the markets calm down. And that obviously would independent of whatever we are required to do in Australia in terms of fiscal and monetary policy, that could have a dampening effect on inflation going forward.
Yeah, well, it's a multifaceted story, isn't it? So we've got all the issues to do with higher food prices, so they're very much to the fore, whether you look at beef or whether you look at vegetables, they're both very high. You've got the oil situation. I think that the ABS said 183 was the sort of the rate for per litre of fuel. It's gone up above that. Then, of course, they brought in this temporary relief. So next quarter, it might be a little lower. But the other factor is that building construction was 5.7% higher, right? So effectively, all of this forward stimulus, thanks to bringing forward the development programs and the first-time buyer schemes and everything, pulled forward a lot of development. And of course, the cost of goods for building, the cost of labour for building, are both being significantly driven higher. So this is a very broad-based number. It's not down to one specific thing. And that is why I think this inflation is going to be more sticky than many people are suggesting.
There was one morning in March of 2020 when you had a coordinated series of press conferences by a number of central banks, starting with New Zealand, the United States, the UK, Australia, etc. And they all basically said in unison, we are going to unleash extraordinary monetary policy. And effectively, if you read between the lines, it was QE to infinity. Yep. So at that point, I changed my position because the policymakers had changed their position, and I said, well, we're not going to have any form of deflation because they're basically saying we're willing to print as much as required in order to keep this bubble intact. And that's why I switched my position to stagflation. And then, so just to remind the audience, in April 2020, so I wrote an article, like a 6,000-word essay for my website, but then you and I did a two-part show. It's called The Australian Economy Has Been Completely Destroyed Within 4 Weeks, and that was a discussion about that whole scenario. And then we did a show in August of 2020 called Stagflation is Occurring Before Your Very Eyes. And we did a number of stagflation shows in 2020. And then after the US election, when Joe Biden was inaugurated, we came back on the 12th of February last year, 2021, and we did a show entitled "Joe Biden Will Unleash Accelerated Stagflation," and we highlighted a number of additional factors that the Biden administration was doing, both on the demand side and the supply side, that was going to exacerbate stagflation. And that's what exactly happened in 2021. And obviously now those factors have come home to roost here in Australia. And that's why we have now the highest level of official inflation in 20 years. But somehow the RBA completely missed it. And so can we play the clip between Senator Rennick and Deputy Governor Bullock, and we'll just hear this sort of exchange.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, guys. In November, the RBA was signalling rates would be on hold until early 2024, and rate rises this year were very unlikely. In light of yesterday's comments, how did the RBA get that so wrong?
Well, I think, Senator Rennick, that we were in absolutely unusual times. I don't think anyone at the beginning of the pandemic would have predicted that we'd be in a position now around the world where inflation was picking up so dramatically. We're not the only country where this is occurring, and in fact, it's occurring around the world to more extent than it is here. So I think the best thing to do in those circumstances is you look at the evidence, and if the evidence is telling you that something else is happening, then you change your view, and that's what we've done.
Well, yeah, it's pretty clear. Some people knew, some people didn't. If only she'd been watching our shows.
Well, I mean, the thing is, one of the surprising things, I've had some correspondence with Senator Rennick this afternoon, and I told him we'll be showing the clip of him and his exchanges in Parliament. He actually said that perhaps you and I should be, heading the RBA. but I mean, to be honest, it's not that hard to know that when you print exorbitant sums of money through, the record low cash rate, quantitative easing, yield curve control, the term funding facility, and all the other sort of techniques that the RBA used, that it was going to lead to a sharp set of consequences. Now, perhaps the RBA will say, well, during the pandemic, we didn't anticipate the war between Russia and the Ukraine, and that has a short-term temporary factor. I mean, we can give them a bit of leeway on that. But particularly, as you said, that a lot of the increase in inflation in this quarter was driven by housing. That housing was driven by the pandemic monetary policy and fiscal policy, and that was very well anticipated, and that's why I basically said stagflation, and that's why we did all these shows in 2020 and 2021. So if anyone is now suffering the consequences of these policies, and they believe the RBA when they say no one could foresee this, well, I mean, I think Our shows are still up on YouTube. Anyone can review them. I have my writings up on my website. They're still public. I think our record speaks for itself, and hopefully when Parliament comes back in October, when estimates is back and the RBA is before the Senate Economics Committee, that perhaps one or two senators can refer to some of our work and say to the RBA, well, perhaps you need to come to Wollongong and have a chat to a couple of smart cookies who actually figured this all out well before the RBA board sat down and actually tried to read the tea leaves.